When you think of grand strategy games, what comes to mind? Civilization, Total War, Hearts of Iron, Crusader Kings, the many other Paradox strategy games, and of course others. There's one strategy game series that I feel is particularly overlooked, especially when you look at its history and the fact that it's been around for literally 40 years. You saw the title of the video. That series is Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and I want to talk about it. Romance of the Three Kingdoms is based on an ancient Chinese novel of the same name, depicting a tumultuous civil war at the turn of the 3rd century. As you would expect with a game series that's been around for 40 years and got 14 entries, Romance of the Three Kingdoms has changed, morphed, and evolved many times. I thought it would be an interesting journey to look at how these games have changed in terms of graphics, gameplay, music, and so on, like a little video game time capsule. Come join me on a 40-year journey of playing Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the most underrated strategy game series of all time. The first Romance of the Three Kingdoms, or ROTK as I'll refer to the series as well, released on a number of consoles including the Amiga, MS-DOS, PC-98, MSX, NES, and some other early home consoles. I'll be playing the NES version released in 1989 first, and then switch over to the DOS version. So right away you can obviously tell that the game is old. It's older than me by at least a decade. As you can imagine, games this old come with some issues, at least by modern gaming standards. As soon as I started setting up my first scenario, I realized that just the menus alone were going to be a little bit of a challenge to navigate. You're essentially using the D-pad to select all of the numbers and commands. By the end of my session though, I mostly got the hang of it. For my NES playthrough, I decided to choose Cao Cao since he's often the best character in ROTK games, and I figured I would need all the help I could get. That's why I also chose a low difficulty for my game, and then I was thrown into ancient China. I started out on the map of China as the game cycled through the turns of the other factions. Eventually it got to my turn and I was instantly overwhelmed by the menu screen. There is a lot of info packed on this little screen and a lot of different actions that I could take. Having little idea of what any of this game really meant, I found a copy of the game's manual online. I'm not sure I've ever consulted a game's manual in my entire life, so that's something. The manual was helpful in explaining what exactly I was looking at on screen. I won't go over everything, but the important things are your gold to recruit new troops and keep your generals paid, rice to feed your troops and peasants, and men, which are your actual troops you take to war. So while it was great to learn what everything was, I still wasn't sure exactly how much of anything was a good amount. I decided I'd worry about that later, since first I wanted to get an idea of the skill of my current generals. Unsurprisingly, Cao Cao had some good officers. I also want to mention one of the best parts of this game, the little animations that happen when you take an action. Just look at the one for searching. Way cuter than it has any right to be. Since searching your own state doesn't take up your action, I decided to search another state and compare myself to them. Unfortunately, I decided to randomly choose state 1, which was empty, essentially wasting my first turn. I wasn't too concerned as I figured I'd be able to start building up my resources over the next few turns before I got pulled into any battle. Well, I was wrong. That same turn, my first turn by the way, I ended up getting attacked by Dong Zhuo. Being suddenly thrown into a battle screen I was so unfamiliar with, I panicked and brought nearly all of my officers to defend, even those I knew had terrible war stats. I then fumbled my way through placing all of my troops. At the time, I didn't realize how capturing a castle actually worked, so I randomly placed my units around. Thankfully, the game allows you to let your generals automatically complete their own turns. I chose that option for each of my generals since I had no idea what I was doing. I was really lucky that I did this for two reasons. First, my generals actually went to defend the castle like we were supposed to, and second, having to control every general would have made the battle take so much longer than it already did. After the battle started, Lu Bu immediately charged straight at me. Being the only general with a troop count even close to his, I confronted him with Cao Cao. I set fire to Lu Bu's unit on my turn, not really sure what it would do. A turn later, Lu Bu randomly defected and turned to my side. I don't know why he did this other than it's Lu Bu and betrayal is kind of his thing. Now with Lu Bu on my side, I sent him towards Dong Zhuo and sent Cao Cao back to safety. Unfortunately, either by pure chance or my own incompetence, Lu Bu then burned to death and all 13,000 of his troops disappeared. It was actually kind of shocking to see a major character just die like that, so that obviously sucked, but on the bright side, Lu Bu still wasn't on the enemy side anymore, and now I wouldn't have that headache of trying to keep his loyalty up. More importantly, I still had a battle to win. Reading through the manual, I saw that one way to win a battle on defense is just for enough time to pass, so that was my first strategy. Dong Zhuo wasn't going to let that happen though, and sent his two remaining generals at me. Soon, there were flames absolutely everywhere and I was worried about more of my generals burning alive, especially Cao Cao. Eventually, I defeated both of the enemy generals using Cao Cao with little to no help from my other generals as they just sat in the castle. I captured one enemy general and executed the other. Why? I really just randomly chose. With no other officers besides himself, even though he still had the troop count advantage, Dong Zhuo fled from the battle and I was victorious. So that was that, my first victory in ROTK done. While I think the battle system is fine for the time, it stuck out to me as the most dated part of the game. The battle took me around 30 minutes, which itself isn't a problem, but my issue comes from the fact that the battle felt so long because a majority of the time was spent watching the map slowly move to another general only for them to pass their turn and do nothing. I think I could have sped this up a little bit in the options by changing the display wait time, but I only discovered that after I had finished a second battle. Moving on, for some reason I don't understand, I now controlled state 6 and Dong Zhuo controlled state 12. I assume these were due to the battle that just happened, but it makes no sense as I wasn't attacking 6 and Dong Zhuo wasn't attacking 12. What I think may have happened is Dong Zhuo was forced to flee to 12 instead of his own province, but I'm not sure. Anyways, I continued fumbling my way through the menus. I gave a little bit of rice to the peasants to increase their loyalty, getting another nice little cutscene, recruited some troops, and then took a look at what was going on in state 12. When I searched the state, I saw Dong Zhuo was there on his own, so I decided to attack. Even though this battle had less generals than the last one, it still took forever to get through since everyone was spread out on a large map and the screen slowly crawled around to everyone. I also extended the battle by not quite understanding how capturing a castle worked. I thought you had to defeat all the enemy generals, but it turns out you can simply place a general on each of their castle tiles to win. By sheer luck, I chased Dong Zhuo out of the castle using fire and just happened to move on the last castle tile to win the battle. So we captured Dong Zhuo and he was automatically executed. At this point, I was feeling pretty done with the game. Everything just felt so slow and clunky that even though the game mechanics were pretty interesting and much deeper than I expected, it wasn't worth slowly forcing my way through it. So obviously, my experience with ROTK 1 on NES wasn't great, but I didn't want to end this game on a bad note. I decided to do a little digging and see if other versions of the game were any better. I eventually settled on trying the MS-DOS version of ROTK 1 before moving on. So immediately, the DOS version of the game felt much better to play. Everything loaded up so much faster and typing commands was so much more natural than using the D-pad to select your action. However, this version wasn't without its own drawbacks. For this playthrough, I decided to go with Sun Xuan and a different scenario. The first negative of this version was that I had no music at all. It was weird because there were still sound effects, but the soundtrack itself was gone. It wasn't a big deal, but it kinda sucked since I actually enjoyed the 5 or so songs in this game. The graphics of the game are rough too compared to the NES version, and the little animations aren't nearly as cute anymore. The next issue came up when I got to the menu. This is a DOS game after all, so instead of having your possible actions displayed on screen, you literally have to read the manual while playing just to know what command to type in for an action. For a zoomer like myself, this wasn't a fun process. I eventually started to memorize the commands I was using often, but I found myself checking the manual many times just to get through each turn. To be honest though, I would definitely take these drawbacks over playing the NES version again. I had much more fun playing through the DOS version since everything moved so much faster, especially the battles. As Sun Quan, I went and attacked a few of Liu Biao's provinces. Through a combination of the DOS's faster processing and me learning the game more, I flew through battles in this game. On average, the time it took me to complete a battle was 3 times shorter than on the NES. Other than that though, the games are pretty similar. The DOS version gave me a few more different types of actions than I had on the NES, but nothing super different besides maybe the ability to abandon your kingdom and wander around. So that was my experience with ROTK 1. Overall, it wasn't really as bad as I thought it would be, especially the DOS version. Is it a game that I'll ever play again just in my free time? Probably not. I do want to applaud the game for its depth. For example, having a wind mechanic that changes throughout the battle and dictates which way fire will go. I wasn't expecting a game originally from 1985 to have that. And that's not to mention the relatively robust diplomacy options too. Despite that, I'm going to rank ROTK 1 in the F tier. It's really not a bad game, just really old. Too old to be very enjoyable, so I really can't recommend that you go out of your way to play it. Next up is Romance of the Three Kingdoms 2, released in 1991 on the NES, SNES, DOS, Amiga, Mega Drive, and the other million other consoles available at the time. I played the SNES version, hoping it would mechanically be a big improvement over the NES game, and I was not disappointed at all. As soon as I loaded up the game and got an admittedly simple cutscene, I knew we were taking a step up from the first game. For starters, the graphics are much easier on the eyes. The map on the SNES is much more similar to the DOS map on the original game, which is a huge improvement over the NES version. But by far, the biggest graphical update comes during the battles. It's really great to be able to actually tell what terrain I'm looking at during a battle. It's so much easier to keep track of all my units, and there's no more waiting for the camera to slowly move to each officer when it's their turn. The other major improvement in this game is the UI. It is way more user-friendly, and I didn't need a manual just to figure out what was going on and what actions I could take. I could also quickly navigate the menu and find the action I wanted to take in no time. The menu navigation isn't perfect, of course, but way better than what the first game had on either NES or DOS. Now that's not to say this game is extremely user-friendly and someone could just jump right in blind. You definitely still need to learn this game. For my ROTK2 playthrough, I decided to play as Liu Bei in the 194 AD scenario. In this scenario, Liu Bei starts in a relatively safe location. You do have the strong rulers Lu Bu and Sun Ce as neighbors, but you also have the extremely weak Kong Rong to the north and nobody to the south. So, unlike the first game, you get multiple actions per turn depending on how many officers you have. If you had 10 officers in a province, you could potentially have 10 different actions you could take. While this is a better mechanic than the first game, I often found myself not knowing what to do with all these available actions each turn. Almost every action that's actually helpful in the game requires gold, and it's not like you really have a lot of it. I found myself spending a lot of turns just training soldiers, viewing other kingdoms, and trying to steal officers from other kingdoms. It kind of felt like I was wasting turns, but I legitimately didn't know what else to do. So on the first turn of the game, Kong Rong asked me to become his ally, which I accepted since I am good guy Liu Bei. Little did I know at the time that these alliances mean absolutely nothing. The next turn, Kong Rong was captured by Li Zhu and executed. Wu Anguo, Kong Rong's only officer, became the new ruler. With Kong Rong suddenly gone, I decided to bring his land under the benevolent rule of Liu Bei. Wu Anguo only had 10 soldiers, so I sent Zhang Fei and Guan Yu with 40 soldiers each to attack. The battle was over as soon as it had begun, and we easily defeated Wu Anguo. After winning, the only option I had was to behead Anguo, which felt harsh by Liu Bei's standards. Nevertheless, I now controlled provinces 8 and 16. In hindsight, this was my first mistake of the playthrough, as I had to split my already small number of generals to be able to run both provinces. Over the next few turns, I developed some of my land, tried to recruit some more officers, and quote-unquote allied with Lu Bu, Sun Ce, and Yuan Shu. Now in an alliance with just about all of my neighbors, I felt comfortable putting some officers into Province 18 and expanding my kingdom to 3 areas. This would prove to be my biggest mistake, as I didn't have nearly enough soldiers to properly defend 3 provinces. The idea in my head though was that I was allied with everyone, so surely I wouldn't get attacked without a warning of them breaking the alliance first, right? My ultimate goal was to surround and destroy Sun Ce, since he was the biggest threat in my immediate vicinity. Sun Ce must have realized this, because without warning he attacked Province 18. Before the battle began, I was prompted to suggest personal combat. I didn't know what this meant, but since I had no chance to win this fight anyway with 20 measly soldiers against their 182, I selected yes. This suddenly brought me into an automated duel between Zhang He and Lu Meng. The duel was actually extremely hype. I figured I had it easy with Zhang He's higher war stat, but Lu Meng actually held the lead for a lot of the duel. It actually came down to the very final swing, with Zhang He making the ultimate comeback down 5 points to Lu Meng's 10. So with the duel won, all of Lu Meng's 80 troops were wiped out. This would have been great had I not only had 20 troops myself. If I had just been a little more prepared, I actually would have had a great chance to win this battle. Unfortunately, I was not, and Zhou Tai handled me easily. So Province 18 was now gone, and now I was encircled by other provinces. I was honestly pretty mad at this, and was ready to go get my revenge. However, I wasn't really prepared to do so. I also didn't want to leave my other provinces open to attack now that I knew that alliances meant nothing. Sun Ce even decided to rub his victory in my face by asking for an alliance, which I accepted for some reason. So at this point the game became a little bit of a slog. I was ready for another battle, but I didn't have the troops to do so yet or the money to hire more troops. So I spent a lot of time stealing officers from other kingdoms and doing what little I could each turn. Eventually I felt ready to take Province 18 back. I decided to take 255 troops and 4 officers to go attack Zhou Tai's 175 troops and 4 officers. The battle started out with another duel where Zhang Fe completely decimated Lu Meng. That was another 50 troops gone from Zhou Tai's army. Surely this could only end in victory, right? So I slowly made my way over to the enemy and took out their officers one by one until only Zhou Tai remained. Clearly, I do not understand combat in this game, because my officers with high war barely did any damage to Zhou Tai, even with double the amount of troops. I spent literally 10 whole minutes clicking mostly the same attack buttons over and over again and watching everyone's troop count slowly go down. I was well on my way to winning the battle too, until, in my frustration with how long this was taking, I made the worst misclick of my entire life. I honestly couldn't tell you if I was even looking at the screen or even knew I was using Liu Bei, but I sent Liu Bei into a charge against Zhou Tai. A charge is basically a big attack where it's all of your troops against all of their troops, and it doesn't end until dozens of troops are gone. I had done a charge, again by accident, once before, so as soon as I saw the menu box appear, I knew the battle was over. Zhou Tai wiped out Liu Bei, then captured him and executed him. I had to sit through a sad cutscene, choose an heir, and then I was sent back to the overworld map. At this point, I had lost the will to keep going, and I figured I had seen most of what this game had to offer. ROTK 2 was a pretty fun experience. The game is definitely still dated, but it is 100 times better than the original game. Unlike the first game, I feel like I could actually complete an entire scenario of this game if I really needed to. I think if I spent more time really perfecting the battle mechanics and learning how to properly handle my resources, I could have a pretty good time with this game. So ROTK 2 will go in the D tier for me. It's literally better in every way, except it doesn't have the cute little animations. I still don't really recommend this game, but if you wanted to play a piece of strategy game history, play this game over the first game. Romance of the Three Kingdoms 3: Dragon of Destiny released in 1993 on PC, SNES, Mega Drive, and Genesis. I'll be playing the SNES version for this video. While ROTK 2 is really just a better version of the first game, ROTK 3 feels like it actually took a leap in quality by adding some new features and changing some mechanics. For example, the battles were changed up. There are now different officer ranks and unit types. There's very basic character creation, a new agriculture system which frankly I did not understand, and much more. That's not even mentioning how much better the graphics and menus look in this game compared to the last two. For this playthrough, I went with Yuan Shao in the Dongzhuo's Rivals Unite scenario. Yuan Shao was definitely a solid choice for a ruler, as he has decent stats, some decent civil officers, and a few great military officers. However, Yuan Shao's officers did have one downside which definitely held me back throughout my playthrough. So in ROTK 3, your officers are split up into 4 different categories. Those being a general, advisor, civil officer, and military officer that each have their advantages and disadvantages. Generals are allowed to carry out both military and civil commands, but they have to have certain military abilities to reach this rank. They also can only work on assignments for 1 month or turn, and I'll get back to why that sucks. Next is advisors. Advisors can also carry out military and civil commands. They also must have certain intellectual abilities, and most importantly, your chief advisor will let you know if a command you are trying to do is likely to succeed or not. Unfortunately, they can also only work on a task for 1 month. Military officers and civil officers are pretty self-explanatory. They can only do most military or civil tasks respectively, but they can work on a task for up to 6 months, which is a big benefit. So let's get back to this 1 month thing. The reason it sucks to only be able to work on a task for 1 month is because certain tasks require you to do it for multiple months in order to get the full effects of the task. And generally, it's just more convenient not having to assign the same task every single month. For example, spying on another faction. Spying on a faction is the only way to learn how many troops they have, how many supplies they have, and the stats of their officers. All information that is crucial to deciding whether you should attack them or not. To be able to actually get most information through spying, you have to do it for multiple months, especially if your officer doesn't have high stats. The issue with Yuan Shao's officers is that the number of advisors and generals heavily outweighs the number of military and civil officers. This left me with a bunch of officers that could only do tasks for 1 month, which not only arbitrarily extended my time assigning tasks each month, but also made it difficult to perform certain tasks like spying. Now, you can technically demote a general or advisor to one of the lower ranks, but it lowers their loyalty when you do that. And let me tell you that loyalty in this game is a problem. Not only does it cost money that I did not have to raise loyalty, but you are constantly under threat of other factions poaching your officers. It's safe for me to say that I did not enjoy this new officer rank mechanic. Anyways, back to my actual playthrough. Jumping into the game, I immediately began focusing on improving my economy to earn more gold each 6 months. I also tried to improve my agriculture, but I was told that going all in on money and buying food later is the way to go. I also gave food to my citizens to improve their loyalty and trained up my troops. Eventually, I received a message from Kong Rong asking me to become allies with him. Am I having deja vu? I have to say, I like how much diplomacy was improved in this game. Instead of just having the option to accept, refuse, or try to capture the messenger of an alliance like in ROTK 2, you now can counter-offer by asking for supplies in order for you to accept the alliance. This adds a whole new layer of depth to the alliances. What's also great about alliances is that you can't just break them without consequences. Well, okay, that's not totally true. There is a workaround for players to break alliances without consequence through the threaten command, but mainly it's the computer that will be punished. Anyways, I hustled Kong Rong for some gold, and now we were in an alliance. Speaking of gold, that was certainly my biggest issue throughout this playthrough. I'm not entirely sure why, but I suspect that Yuan Shao just has so many officers that I had to pay that it was stopping me from having much profit when taxes came in. Throughout my time playing, I found myself either selling food for gold to get troops, or buying food when I was ready to go to war. There was never any point I felt super comfortable with my supplies. Much like in actual history, my first goal as Yuan Shao was to conquer northern China, starting with Gongsun Zan, the only threat to the north. My plan was to take all of the cities up north and start piling up on gold and supplies to invade southward. So finally, about an hour and a half into my playthrough, I finally got into my first battle in this game. Unlike ROTK 2, you can't always directly invade another faction's castle. Throughout the map, there are certain battlefields that act as a buffer between castles. The battlefield battles don't have anything specifically to capture, your objective is just to wipe out the opposing army. This game also introduced naval battles, but I didn't happen to play one of those in this playthrough. I don't think they're really too different from the normal field battles though. So for this battle, I had 4 units against 2 enemy units and triple the amount of troops. Something interesting to note is that battles now go through a day and night cycle as well as weather changes that were in previous games. As you would expect, visibility drops to literally 1 square in front of you during night, meaning you really can't see anything. And fog is even worse than that, dropping visibility to literally 0. Now this first battle against Gongsun Zan wasn't difficult, but it was annoying. Right away, the enemy officers started running away from mine. And with the nighttime and fog, it was very difficult to chase them for a majority of the battle. I'm not exactly sure what the computer was trying to accomplish either, seeing as I had much more supplies than they did, so they would have starved and had to flee first. After about 10 minutes of chasing around my enemies though, I was able to destroy them and won the battle. With that battle won, I started preparing to attack Gongsun Zan's castle. Surprisingly though, Zan actually attacked me at the battlefield before I could strike. Fortunately, the previous battle had wiped most of their supplies, so he only could send 1 unit to attack me. I sent my 2 best officers to the battlefield and took care of Zan in only a couple minutes. Before attacking Gongsun Zan City, I decided to start an alliance with Liu Bei to the south since he was the new biggest threat to me, and then it was time. I gathered my 4 best officers again, including Yuan Shao, and marched to Gongsun Zan's final city. So castle sieges are where the gameplay really changes up from previous games. Instead of a castle being a single tile that you would have to attack or defend, you now have to attack proper cities with walls and gates that you have to break through. Now it isn't anything super special as you just have to break down the gates to get inside, but there is the possibility for archers to shoot at you over the castle walls while you are doing so. So the first part of my siege was simple. I broke through the city gates with no resistance at all. Once inside, it was back to your typical battle. One thing I'd like to note about ROTK 3 are the different unit types. There's your normal infantry, crossbows, heavy crossbows, cavalry, and then the naval units. Having long-ranged attacks with crossbows really adds to the gameplay and helps make battles a little bit more tactical and dynamic. I like that it's no longer just swarm your enemies, but instead you should tactically place your units to get the best damage. Anyways, I handled Gongsun Zan fairly easily again, and the city was mine. Unfortunately, Zan managed to escape to the free city to the east, so I wasn't quite done with my enemy yet. What was great though was that I now had a pretty good amount of gold and food thanks to stealing everything Zon had in the city. With Zon obviously reeling in his brand new city, I pressed the attack and went to finish him off. This new city was smaller than the previous one, so we took it quickly with just 3 units. After capturing Gongsun Zon, I had the option to capture him or free him. I'm not quite sure why they called it capture, when it was pretty clear that I executed the guy, but nonetheless, I now controlled the north. So from there, the rest of my playthrough wasn't much different. I kept developing, forming alliances, and eventually I attacked Kong Rong. Kong Rong had a lot of supplies, but was lacking in good officers and troops. While I wasn't worried about losing at any point, this was definitely the toughest battle I had so far. In fact, the battle took so long that the game took me back to the map to give my orders for the month before continuing the battle. I did end up defeating Kong Rong though, and I set him free since he really wasn't too much of a threat. And so there I decided to cut my playthrough just so I could keep moving on with these games, since I feel like I got a pretty good feel of ROTK 3. Overall, I thought this game was really good. It finally feels like we're starting to move out of that territory where the games feel too dated to play. This game moves fast, the graphics look good, and the menus are alright too. I did still need the manual to understand everything, but that's to be expected with this generation of games. The negative that I would give this game is that the battles are a little clunky and sometimes take way longer than they need to, like if the enemy is just constantly running away from you. It's also kind of frustrating not being able to see my troop count on the battle screen, and instead I always have to inspect my units to check it. It just kind of feels like a waste of time. Since this game is a step up above both 1 and 2, it will go in the C tier for me. This is a game that I could consider just playing in my free time, but for me it's maybe still just a tiny bit too dated. Not a bad choice at all though for an SNES strategy game. ROTK 4 released in 1994 for PC, SNES, the Sega consoles, the PlayStation 1, and a few other consoles. While I think the SNES is great and all, I am very excited to finally start moving into the PlayStation era of the ROTK games, just because I generally find them easier to play than games on older consoles. ROTK 4 again is another upgrade in quality over the previous game. The graphics are greatly improved, the menus are easy to read and navigate through, and there are a few changes to mechanics that make the game a little less tedious. The first mechanic that I appreciate, even though I didn't realize it until halfway through my playthrough, is that you no longer have to send an officer out to each individual city to spy on it and gather information. Instead, your officer now searches an entire region of cities, and the regions are indicated in a different color background on the map. I believe this works the same for when you are searching for new officers to hire as well. Another great change in 4 is how city development is handled. In previous games, you had to spend an officer's monthly action on developing the economy or farms in your city. In 4, development is done kind of in the background instead. You assign whichever officers you want to a certain area of development, provide them with gold to do it, and the development will happen automatically each month so long as they have enough gold. It doesn't use the officer's turn either, giving more flexibility on how to use your officers each month. Now this isn't to say that exactly everything is better in 4 though. I personally think I preferred the battles in 3 over the battles in 4. When an army attacks in 4, the defending side gets the chance to defend out in the field first, or fight them directly at the castle. Battles in the field are extremely similar to battles in previous games. Where 4 changes things up though is with the new castle sieges. We'll go through castle sieges in detail as I talk about my playthrough in this game. For this game, I decided to play as Sun Ce in the turmoil spreads in China scenario. Now technically I did 2 playthroughs as Sun Ce. The first playthrough wasn't amazing as I didn't understand everything about the game yet. My second playthrough, with a little bit more knowledge and experience, did go a lot better. Let's quickly run through attempt 1 first. So in this scenario, Sun Ce starts in the city of Lujiang, which, I didn't know at first, is not a good city to start with. For starters, I had somewhat powerful enemies on either side of me with Liu Yong and Liu Biao to the east and west respectively. The one saving grace though is that there are free cities available to the south so that you can build up more supplies without fighting right away. Another good thing about Sun Ce is that your officer quality is a lot better than your neighbors, which can be a big advantage. So immediately I started looking at my city's resources and I realized there was a huge problem. Thankfully, in ROTK 4, you are told the exact amount of gold and food that you will either gain or lose come tax season or harvest season based on your city's development. Unfortunately, Lujiang was projected to come out with a net negative amount of food when it was time to harvest, so fixing that became my first priority. One little nitpick that I have in this game is that when you have to select a city for something, such as development, spying, or searching for officers, the game has to load in a new menu. Now really, it doesn't take that long to load, but when you have to go into that menu a lot, not to mention you can easily misclick, that little second or two it takes to load in and then go back to the original menu gets a little frustrating. However, something great about this game is that they brought back the cute little animations from the first game. 4 automatically gets bonus points for that. And it doesn't just have cute little animations either, this game also utilizes short videos from the 1994 Romance of the Three Kingdoms TV series. Pretty cool. Anyways, continuing on with the playthrough, I pretty quickly fixed the food deficit issue. However, not even an hour in, I made what I think was my most fatal mistake. So from the beginning, my whole plan was to take out Liu Biao first, and dominate the southern part of the map. Looking over Liu Biao's officers, one of the only ones that I thought could give me problems was Gan Ning. Since Gan Ning eventually served Wu anyway, I figured he wouldn't be very loyal and I tried to recruit him away. The only way I could do so though was by paying him 600 gold out of the 1000 or so that I had. I didn't think this was such a big deal in the grand scheme of things. You spend money to make money, right? I'd get it back in the tax season in January anyway, I figured. So Gan Ning was hired and I was feeling pretty good despite being low on funds. Developing my city started to get rough as everything was just running out of gold and I didn't have any more to invest. I eventually sold some food for more gold, but the selling rates were pretty bad and it didn't help me out much. I waited things out until tax season came around and I got some good luck since one of Liu Biao's officers rebelled and stole a city from him. So here was the big problem. Even though I just collected taxes, I really didn't collect enough money to be able to sustainably develop my city. It kind of turned into a cycle where I was technically making a profit every year, but not by much since my city's development was slow due to underfunding. So, unsure of how to fix my financial problems, I decided taking one of Liu Biao's cities and hopefully his supplies in the process was the best option. As I set my troops to march, Zhou Yu came to me with an interesting plan. In ROTK 4, there's a cool mechanic where you can ask, or pay, tribes to attack your enemies to soften them up a little bit before you attack. I did this multiple times with the Shan Yue tribe. I don't really know how helpful it was, but they were pretty easy to get to attack if you paid them with a couple horses. Anyways, it was now time for my first battle. I marched with 3 units and the majority of my troops since I was pretty desperate to take over this city. I clashed with Liu Biao in the field first. My officers easily outclassed his, and we won the battle pretty easily. Sun Ce himself even participated in a duel and one-shotted his opponent, so that's pretty cool. One thing that I didn't enjoy about the battles that is carried over from ROTK 3 is that your officers' troop counts are not always displayed on screen. What is better than 3 though is that at least when an attack happens, the game does show your troop counts, so it's at least tolerable. I will be very happy though when we get to the games that display your troop count and the name of your officer controlling the unit on screen at all times. After easily winning the field battle, we're on to the first castle siege. Now this castle siege is not a great representation of how they usually are since I pretty much decimated Liu Biao in the field. We'll take a look at a much better castle siege in a little bit. For castle sieges, there's a couple ways for attackers to win. You can either use ladders to climb the castle walls and destroy all the defending units, or you can attack and destroy the castle gates, which are now much tankier than they were in 3. Now both of these are dangerous feats as defenders can drop boulders on you that do a ton of damage. I didn't get this far into the game, but I do know there are also battering rams and catapults that you can build that I'm sure are mandatory to take cities later in the game. Back to the battle, since it took longer than a month in game, I got the opportunity to send reinforcements to the battle, and I did so. My troop count was getting a little low, so I wanted to ensure my victory, and eventually we managed to break down the gate and capture the city. Now after the battle, I had the opportunity to decide what to do with my captured enemies. So this is when things got really bad. My original city of Lujiang was now facing constant revolt from citizens. Revolts means that your population goes down and your public support goes down. Your public support is tied to how many revolts will happen, while your population is tied to how much you harvest, and I believe how much taxes you receive. It was at this time that I realized how horrible of a city Lujiang and the city I just captured were. Both of these cities had really low populations of under 200,000. This meant that I'll never really make that much money there, and it would take a long time to climb out of the financial mess I put myself in, especially with Lujiang's population just dropping more and more. So, I abandoned Lujiang and took over the free city of Changsha with a population of 300,000. I moved everyone over to my two new cities and tried to start anew, but it was too little too late. I had no gold in Changsha, my public support was terrible so the population was dropping, and I decided to completely start over with my new knowledge of how the game works. Alright, so attempt number 2, I'll make this one quick. I abandoned Lujiang for Chaisang immediately. There were almost instant revolts in Chaisang, so I moved everything to Changsha, which was my ultimate destination anyway with that sweet 300k population. My priority now was to get my public support up so that there was no chance of revolts, and then turn to development, and make sure not to give Ganning 600 gold this time. At least not when that's half my gold. Developing Changsha went perfectly, and I was confident enough to move into the neighboring free city of Guiyang. Guiyang was perfect since it was safe from attacks from Liu Biao, and I could focus solely on building up food and gold for my expansion. With my new abundance of food and gold, Liu Biao was cooked. I was able to afford way more troops than I could before, and I went on the attack. Liu Biao's first city fell with little problem, and the city had over 200k population, so gold and food would be no issue. Surprisingly, Liu Biao's second city fell with no bloodshed at all actually, so I noticed that one of Liu Biao's cities only had one officer in it that month. Kind of weird because Liu Biao had a decent amount of officers still. Anyway, I had money, so I figured why not try to hire the only officer in the city. What I figured would happen was that the city would become free and I'd be able to take it with no problem, but it turned out to be even easier. When you hire a governor of a city, their city comes with them, which does make sense. So just like that in my second run with the exact same amount of playtime, but obviously in a much better position, Liu Biao was down to only one city and I was expanding rapidly. It was time for a final showdown. I took my 4 best military officers with plenty of troops and marched for Liu Biao's capital, a city with 600k population in case you were wondering. I knew the fight would be tough, but I had the soldier and officer advantage, so I was confident. Zhou Tai and Ganning on the enemy side was a little scary though, I will say. Now this battle was a proper siege. At first, I struggled a little bit with figuring out exactly how to handle this. The castle gates were tanky and boulders were flying right and left onto my army. I quickly realized that I probably didn't have the troops to take down the gate, so I went to scale the castle walls instead. It took some boulders, some baiting, and some evasive maneuvers, but I eventually managed to get units on the castle walls. I also learned you can fight an enemy while you are on the ladder, which seems odd to me, but I'll allow it. Once I was on the walls, the boulders stopped being a factor, and the battle was basically over. Now technically, Liu Biao wasn't done. He ran away to another city, but he essentially had no officers and only 10 troops. He was basically a non-factor now, and victory was mine. For the sake of getting to other games, I decided to stop my playthrough there. So, straight up, 4 is the best game so far. Some of the quality of life features I mentioned just make the game way less tedious than previous ones. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of the battles, but they're definitely the most dynamic and interesting so far. I could see myself coming back to this game in my free time with no complaints at all. I haven't really mentioned yet either, but the music in this game, especially on the Sega Saturn, slaps. Really good soundtrack there. ROTK 4 is going to jump into the A tier. This is the game you want to play if you want to try a classic ROTK. It's just really good. Now here is where we hit our first of 2 roadblocks. Unfortunately, Romance of the Three Kingdoms 5 was never released in English, so I can't really play it or review it. I will say that graphically the game looks nice, but that's all I can really say. I won't be putting this one on the tier list. On to Romance of the Three Kingdoms 6: Awakening of the Dragon. It released in 1998 and only came out on PlayStation in English, so gone are the days of ROTK on like 10 different consoles at once. For the first time in the series, 6 actually has 2 different types of scenarios to play through. Full scenario is your typical ROTK experience, while short scenarios are timed missions with certain objectives. I decided to try out a short scenario first to help me get acquainted with the game. The first short scenario is the Volunteer Army, which details the start of Liu Bei's story. In the opening cutscene, we learn about the Yellow Turban Rebellion, Liu Bei meets Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, and the trio agree to fight the Yellow Turbans. My objectives for the scenario seem pretty easy. I just need to capture Cheng Yuanji, a Yellow Turban, and capture the cities of Ji and Nanpi. 6 months to do this did seem a little bit quick, but I'm sure it'll be fine. So as soon as I load into the game, I'm a little overwhelmed by all the different numbers, symbols, and letters on my screen. I'm really not a huge fan of how they decided to do the menu in 6. Basically, they put both the city stats and the faction stats together on the same page. The reason they did this is because, as far as I can tell, food and gold is now shared across your kingdom rather than just per city. There's also a new stat for your faction called INET. It's not the internet, but it's your intelligence network. This determines whether you can detect enemy movements or not. If you have good INET, you can battle out in the field, but if your INET sucks, you won't know an enemy has attacked you until they reach your castle. Another difference in this game is that instead of having troops that you equip things like bows or horses, you now just have separate foot soldiers and horsemen along with some other troop types. Once you know what everything is, the menu isn't too hard to read, but I think it's just cluttered and ugly compared to what we've had in previous games. City development is similar to ROTK 4, except you no longer actively put money into it, you just assign officers. Speaking of officers, something interesting they added to 6 is the dream mechanic. Each officer has a dream that determines how they act. You can see the dreams here while I'm creating my character. I'm not exactly sure how each of these equates to what the officer does in game, but it's a cool sounding mechanic at least. Something else they added is the ability to talk to each of your officers. Most of the time it's pretty useless, but sometimes you do learn things, and I think talking to specific officers can even set off different events and things like that. Now, while those are 2 cool mechanics, I have to mention my least favorite mechanic in the game, which is energy. So, in previous ROTK games, officers basically got 1 action each turn, and that was that. I like that. It's simple, easy to follow, you know exactly who is available and who isn't available. In 6, the energy mechanic was added. Now, anytime an officer does an action, they lose energy. I hate energy. I feel like it makes doing actions so much more complex than it needs to be. With energy, there's so much needless and tedious planning and keeping track of things that needs to happen just to get things done efficiently. From what I've read online too, the energy kind of works with the officer's dream and the task they're assigned, and those all work together to determine if they use more or less energy on a task. It's cool for realism, but as a game mechanic, it made the game really not that fun for me. I kept having officers be unavailable for things because of their energy, and it was just really frustrating. Anyways, continuing on, I found my target Cheng Yuanji and the city of Nanpi. Now obviously I have the better officers than him, but he had me outnumbered in troops. I didn't know if I would be able to get enough troops to fight him in time, so I allied myself with Gongsun Zan. So 5 months came very quickly and I had to attack now if I had any hope of winning. The problem is, due to the energy system, Liu Bei and Guan Yu were unavailable to march. So I sent the 3 officers I had, the only good one being Zhang Fei, and marched to Nanpi. This leads me to my second least favorite part of ROTK 6, the battles. So instead of a typical turn-based system that we had in previous ROTK games, 6 does something a little different. At the start of each turn, instead of controlling your officers directly, you give them orders that they will carry out for a few days. I hate this. I don't like losing control over battles, and that's exactly what this feels like. I kind of have to put my faith in my officer's AI, and that's just not very fun to me. I want to play the game, I don't want to watch the game do what it thinks I want to do. All that to say, my first battle went terribly. My officers sucked at war and we lost. That was also the final month I had to complete my objectives, so I lost. I considered quitting right there, but I told myself I needed to stick with it. I jumped back into the exact same scenario, now kind of knowing how energy works. My goal now was just to get as many troops as possible and make sure that everyone was available to go to war. This time I allied with Gongsun Zan again and asked him to attack Nanpi with us by giving him Liu Bei's prized sword. The scenario would be over after this fight anyway, so why did I need the sword? Now equipped with an ally and way more troops, it was time to attack Nanpi again. After messing up my first turn and not giving any orders, I got it right for the second turn even if the enemy did somehow sneak past me and almost got to my main camp. The battle went well from there. The Yellow Turbans got some reinforcements, but it was too little too late and we managed to defeat the enemy commander. After winning the field battle, we moved it directly into the castle siege. Because we outnumbered them greatly, I just sent everyone charging at the castle. After a few turns, we broke down the castle gates and charged at the enemy inside. We beat them with not too much issue and the city was ours. I then stupidly tried to get Cheng Yuanji to join me even though I knew I needed to execute him, but thankfully he didn't join me. With that, the short scenario was completed. I got a nice little cutscene afterwards showing Liu Bei's fame spreading throughout the land. It was a nice little touch, but otherwise, that was really rough. I did not enjoy that short scenario whatsoever. Regardless, I wanted to give the game a little bit more of a chance and I hopped into a full scenario. I decided to keep the Liu Bei train going and chose him in the Dong Zhuo's ambition scenario. This was a mistake. I loaded into the game and literally the first turn, Yuan Shao invaded me. So much for the anti-Dong Zhuo coalition, right? So Yuan Shao had double my troops and he defeated me easily. And my full scenario was over in one single turn. I was really done with this game at this point. I didn't like the strategy phase, I didn't like the battling, so what was the point in continuing? I did spend a few minutes in the Cao Cao versus Lu Bu scenario, but I just couldn't get very far in it. Sorry to any ROTK 6 enjoyers out there, but I really dislike this game. I will say the graphics are good, the music is good, but that's about it. Honestly, if you asked me if I would rather play this or ROTK 1, I don't know what my answer would be. For that reason, 6 will go in the F tier for me, just barely in front of the first game. I do think if you really vibe with this style of game and took the time to learn it, it could be somewhat enjoyable and probably more fun than ROTK 1 overall. Something else I should mention too is that I don't think I'm the only one that doesn't really like this game. Compared to every other ROTK game so far, this game has so little information about it on the internet. I found like one playthrough of it on YouTube, one singular guide on GameFAQs, and I literally could not find the game's manual anywhere online besides one sketchy site that I decided not to trust. Overall, ROTK 6 is just not it. On to the halfway point in the series, Romance of the Three Kingdoms 7 is where things start to get a little weird. Released in 2000, 7 only came out on the PS2 in English. So what's weird about ROTK 7? Well, up to this point in every ROTK game, we've played as the ruler of an entire faction, meaning that we control everything. In 7, you can play as literally any of the hundreds and hundreds of characters in this game. This completely changes everything. Instead of ruling a whole kingdom, you can be a warlord who advises their ruler on what they should do, or you can play as a prefect who controls their own city, or you can even play as a common officer, meaning you just carry out tasks that are assigned to you. And last and definitely least, you can even play as a completely free officer, meaning that you have no one to answer to and no responsibilities. That's not really that fun, but at least it's an option. So this means that ROTK 7 is the first of the officer-based games as opposed to all of the previous ruler-based games. From here on out, the series will flip-flop between the two styles. Now let's get into my time playing ROTK 7. For my playthrough, I decided to start out as a common officer in the Dragon's Ascent playthrough. For my first officer-based game, I wanted to play as a great all-around character who has good stats and everything, so I played as Sima Yi. My goal for this playthrough was to work my way up the ranks and become a warlord to Cao Cao, much like Sima Yi did in actual history. Before we get into the gameplay itself, I want to say that it is so nice to have finally reached the PS2 era. The game looks and runs great. The navigation is nice and easy, and it's definitely a huge step up in quality of life from the early days of ROTK. Oh, and the best part of being on the PS2, an in-game encyclopedia that explains all of the game's mechanics. Goodbye to needing a manual when everything I know is in the game itself. Anyways, I was thrown into the game without any direction. I was stationed in the city of Hine, which was away from the front lines and in complete safety. Since there was no immediate danger, I started out my game by strengthening my relationships with my officers, especially important officers such as Cao Cao and my city's prefect Xiahou En. Having a good relationship with your superiors is obviously a good thing as it increases your chances to receive gifts and promotions, along with the normal work that you put in to serve your faction. Having a good relationship with your superiors is obviously a good thing as it increases your chances to receive gifts and promotions. To raise your relationship with others, you have to first write them letters. After enough letters, they will eventually want to meet you in person. The in-person meetings are how you solidify your relationships with them and are where the benefits start coming in. Writing letters and meeting people is something that I did a lot in this game since it doesn't cost any money to do so. It also can help you hire free officers or officers from other factions, which can give you a lot of deeds. Deeds are probably the most important thing you can get in this game. You gain deeds by helping your kingdom out in a number of ways, including battle and domestic improvements. There is also a top 10 ranking system in this game that measures who the most famous officers are based on your deeds. If you get on this list, you get a nice reward of gold. Somewhat similar to ROTK 6 and its energy system that I hated, ROTK 7 has the action point system. Your action points, or AP, determine what actions your officers can do each month. Now, unlike energy, the AP system is a lot easier to manage since you only need to pay attention to your own AP and not every single one of your officers' AP. When you do tasks that involve other officers, they simply get one action per month and then they're done, much less to keep track of here. Back to my playthrough, I continued on for a while befriending other officers and filling my assignments from my prefect. One benefit to playing as Sima Yi is that, since my stats started out so high, I had no need to train any of my stats up. Your officer has the ability to spend some AP each month to train up your stats so you can get better in a certain area. Sima Yi was already high in everything, so I could dedicate all my AP to my friends and my duties. I continued on with this for a few months before the first of 2 yearly events popped up. The event is called the Tournament of Champions, and it's a tournament of duels between the best military officers in your faction. Since Sima Yi did have a high stat in war, I was hoping to be invited, but it didn't happen throughout my playthrough. I think Cao Cao just has too many amazing military officers, but the nice thing is I could still watch the tournament if I wanted, and no matter what, the game lets me know who wins. I decided to watch the first duel, and after a very strange looking loading screen, the duel began. Unfortunately, duels in this game aren't super engaging as you can see, so that was the last one I watched besides the final round. Zheng Liao won the duel and got a raise, so shout out to him. The next annual event rolled around, which was the poetry contest. Because Sima Yi has very high intelligence, I was actually invited to this contest. This contest is nothing special either though, as the participants read off some poetry and are scored by the judges. Unfortunately, I was up against some literal world-famous poets at the time, and I got last place. That about sums up my gameplay for the next 2 to 3 years in-game. Something that I need to mention about this game is that the pacing is really nice. Turns don't take long at all, so months in the game really fly by and progression happens really quickly. You are often doing the same tasks each turn, so that makes it really quick and easy to get through them. Now that might sound like the game is repetitive, which it is, but almost in a good way. Think of like a good mobile game that's fun, simple, and easy to play, and that's almost what this game has been like so far. Now I can definitely see the argument that this game is too simple to really be called a strategy game, which is kind of true. It almost feels more like a simple life simulator, and that will only continue on with the other officer-based games too. To get to my original point though, this game is quick and simple, which I can appreciate after the depth of some of the other games. So at this point in the playthrough, I'm about 3 years in and about an hour into the game. While I've been chilling in my safe city, Cao Cao has been at war with Liu Bei. After a recent victory, I was suddenly approached to become a prefect of a new frontline city. I accepted of course, and moved to take control of the city of Runan. I spent the next in-game year building up my city. The domestic gameplay really wasn't too different from being a common officer besides having all of the city's officers now at my disposal. We would inevitably be going to war soon. I spent the next couple years in game building up my army, and finally it was time to attack. Before you attack, you have to organize your units. Each unit in this game has a different type, like foot soldiers, crossbows, cavalry, and more that determine how you're able to attack on the battlefield. Naval combat is also pretty prevalent in this game, so you can have upgraded ships as well. Once you have your units, you need to set a tactician that will give you advice on the battle. Before you go into a battle, you must also set up your strategy and ploys. A strategy is basically a guide of how you should march your troops. If you capture all of the bases indicated in your strategy, the enemy will take a massive hit to morale. If morale reaches 0 for either army, the battle is over with the other side being the victor. Next, you have your ploys. Ploys are different abilities you can launch during the battle to either help your side or hurt the enemy. For example, my favorite ploy was Rumor. If Rumor is successful, an enemy officer will just straight up leave the battle. Unfortunately, the unit that Rumor targets is random, but if you get a couple officers to retreat that have a large amount of troops, the battle can instantly swing in your favor. There are a number of other important ploys too, like Rally, which raises your morale, that can get tanked really quickly by other ploys. On defense, you also get the opportunity to set a variety of hidden traps throughout the battlefield, which can be pretty helpful. Once everything is set, you are thrown into a turn-based battle. As a commander, you control all officers outside of reinforcements. If you were just an officer, you would only control yourself instead. Playing battles as a sole officer can get pretty annoying if your allies are stupid, so I much prefer being the commander. The battles themselves are fairly simple. You advance forward, capture bases, and defeat enemy officers. I found that positioning is really important in this game, as some officers will provide extra attacks if you attack an enemy that they are also adjacent to. One downside to this game that does get somewhat addressed in other games is that officers with low intelligence can be severely disadvantaged in battle as they are very prone to enemy tactics. This can make some of the best generals in the game feel sort of handicapped. My first battle in this game went extremely well, and I slaughtered Liu Bei's army while losing very few troops relative to theirs. One thing that you have to be careful though is that as an attacker, you do need to win battles in 30 turns or the battle is simply lost. So after winning that battle, Liu Bei was down to a single city and I was determined to take him out. So I readied my army and marched on, defeating Liu Bei out in the field in another easy battle. Now depending on if your enemies have officers and troops left following a field battle, you then will have to fight a siege battle to capture the city. Siege battles can be a little dicey as your turn count does not reset from the previous field battle. So for example, if you needed 29 days to win a field battle, you would have 1 day to complete the siege, and you would probably lose. Siege battles are different from field battles in that you don't need to move your units around anymore, you now only need to choose your actions. Just like in the field battle, you can use powerful ploys, but you need to set those before you even get into the field battle. This particular siege was extremely easy since Liu Bei barely had any troops left, but attacking fortified cities can be a struggle sometimes. I won this battle and Liu Bei's kingdom was no more. One thing I don't like about this game, and honestly other ROTK games, is that rulers seem to not like to execute captured enemy officers, even if they're supposed to be bitter enemies. For example, Cao Cao just let Liu Bei and Guan Yu go after I captured them, just so they can go join other factions. A few years later in the game, I eventually reached the rank of Warlord. As a Warlord, you no longer are in charge of a city specifically, though you do need to work closely with the prefect of whatever city you are stationed in. The best part of being a Warlord is that you can make suggestions for your ruler to attack other cities. This can definitely speed up the game because at times, your ruler won't attack other cities even when he clearly has the numbers to win it. So there's not much more to the game than that. I continued playing until Wei eventually conquered the land, I reached number 4 on the most famous officers list, and in the end of my game, Xiaohou En, my first prefect, ended up being my best friend. Pretty nice full circle moment there. Overall, ROTK 7 is without a doubt the best ROTK game that I've played in this video up to this point. I think that the gameplay loop is quick and easy, the battles are really fun and don't take a ton of time to get through either, and playing as an officer was a fresh experience. At times, it was nice to not have to control every little aspect of my kingdom. ROTK 7 is going to be our first S-tier game, and I'm definitely going to play more of this game in my free time. I highly recommend it to fans of the time period, or fans of just historical games in general.